The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
White House budgets are both really good insight into what a president sort of values, but at the same time, almost meaningless in the sense that whatever the budget proposes either needs to have the funding appropriated by Congress or needs to be made into law by Congress. So while a budget might say, we want funding for, I don't know, abortion on demand until the kid is 3 or whatever, right? I mean, just make whatever you want up out of thin air. That would tell us a lot about the priorities of the administration if they put something like that in a budget. But unless you get it passed into law and or funded, depending on what we're talking about, it doesn't really matter. So we now have a new White House budget for 2019 from the Trump administration. It's a very political document, and insofar as politics matter, and they do, we should analyze it. And this particular budget that we've received from Donald Trump is a deficit exploding abortion. And by speaking of abortion, since I used that example, I'm talking about the second definition of an abortion, something badly carried out, not a medical abortion. And that is exactly what this is. Donald Trump vowed time and again to reduce the debt and not run up deficits many, many times. On the campaign trail, Trump said to Alex Jones in an interview, we have to end the $400 billion deficit that we were running at the time. Trump said in March of 2016 with the Washington Post that only he would be able to get us out of the deficit and that he would do it, and he would run such a surplus that he would pay off the entire $20 trillion national debt within 10 years. However, Trump's tax cut plan, we already know, is going to add about $1.5 trillion to the deficit, and this new budget is going to add about $400 billion more to the deficit on a yearly basis. And Trump is again doing the opposite of what he said that he would do. And he's doing it in ways that he promised he wouldn't, right? This budget, if carried out as written, would explode the deficit so much. And Trump himself is on record numerous times saying, I'm not going to do it. In fact, remember this tweet from Donald Trump in 2015, where he said, I was the first and only potential Republican candidate to state there will be no cuts to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. The budget cuts funding for Medicaid by $250 billion over the next 10 years. Many departments would see budget cuts. That includes the State Department and the EPA and the Interior Department. And this, in terms of the values it represents, it's actually seen as good by committed Trumpists. They want really small government. They want government doing as little as possible. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later. But Trump also wants to cut funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which funds PBS and NPR, cut funding for the National Endowment for the Arts, cut the Community Development Block Grant Program. It's all gone in Trump's budget. And it tells us the values, which include a repeal of Obamacare. That is still also going on. But who gets more money? Somebody must get more money from a Donald Trump budget, right? Well, yeah, the Defense Department gets more money, and Veterans Affairs gets more money. There's $18 billion in funding in Trump's new budget for the Mexican border wall, which I'm confused now because I thought Mexico was going to pay for. I guess not. If the White House's budget is approved, you will be paying for it through your taxes. And it includes that crony capitalist infrastructure plan that Trump has been talking about now for so long, asking for $200 billion for that, the details of which I've talked about before and we can sort of analyze in its own story. Now, the $85 billion for veterans' medical care and the $17 billion for opioid crisis-related spending, I actually think that that's a good thing. But by and large, this is an absolutely disastrous budget. It also adds money to expand the number of undocumented immigrants that can be detained and held by ICE at any given time. So nothing at all surprising here in terms of the values that the budget communicates, But there are some tricks being played here. One example is the budget claims that by spending $200 billion on infrastructure spending, they will stimulate $1.5 trillion in total infrastructure spending. So this implies a multiplier of 7.5, right? It's absolutely imaginary, okay? If Trump's infrastructure plan were not a crony capitalist handout, as we've talked about before, it would have a positive multiplier effect, right? For every dollar that the government spends on infrastructure, you would get some multiple of that back in economic stimulus. But the multiplier would never, even in the best case, be 7.5. And the way Trump wants to do it, it's definitely not going to be anywhere close to that. And so sort of as designed by Trump, this is going to be really, really good for his buddies with the contracts that they're going to be able to get from themselves, for themselves. But the White House budget is embarrassingly overstating the economic stimulus of this. It comes out of thin air, it's completely bogus, and it's nonsense. So when we look at a budget like this, what we really have to think about is not so much this is what we're going to be spending. It's more, what would this administration do if they had a sort of wish list that could become reality in terms of spending? And it is really, really bad. And I've been saying this for a while, Pat. Congress sets the budget and controls the spending. Republicans don't really want to pass a true budget where they sit down and they say, okay, let's do a line-by-line analysis. Let's rethink our priorities. Let's do the tough work of doing this. They don't want to do that, and they don't really have an incentive to do that because that's a lot of work. They benefit politically from being able to say, hey, here's 5 things we're cutting funding from, and the Trumpists are going to cheer. And here's 5 things we're adding funding for, and the Trumpists are going to cheer. And it's a way to toss the political football again without actually sitting down and really rethinking the entire budget.
Yeah, and the public doesn't think about it in terms that these things may not equal out. So if you raise the military spending by $100 billion and then you cut something that's negligible by and large, like the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, in people's heads, they look at it as the same thing.
Sure.
Right? So you're cutting 3 programs and adding to 2 programs, and people think that that balances out, but it certainly doesn't.
I would actually argue that even if you added $100 billion in one place and took $100 billion from another place, the total economic impact of that might not be zero sum, in the sense that if you take money away from more economically stimulative programs and put it into programs that are less economically stimulative, you might move $100 billion from one place to another and still not come out at zero.
And by the way, Bernie Sanders' plan of providing free education, public university education for all Americans was estimated about $75 billion, and he had a way to pay for it, too, by a tax on Wall Street speculation. But we just add another $100 billion to the military budget, and no one asks questions about it?
There's never a question. You can't question that, because then you're unpatriotic and you don't want the country to succeed. Absolutely horrible budget. Let's think about it really as a political document more so than an actual budget, because it's not going to pass as such, and we'll follow the process of it through Congress. Now, I do want to focus in on one specific area of Donald Trump's 2019 budget. Donald Trump wants to cut all federal funding, period, 100% of it, for PBS and for NPR. That is it's a public broadcasting service. It is national public radio. And I want to remind you of when Mitt Romney ran for president against Barack Obama, and he talked about how as much as he loves Big Bird, of course referencing Sesame Street, which airs on PBS, but he would also cut federal funding for PBS. Remember this moment from the debate a few years ago?
Well, first of all, I will eliminate all programs by this test if they don't pass it. Is the program so critical it's worth borrowing money from China to pay for it? And if not, I'll get rid of it. Obamacare is on my list. I apologize, Mr. President. I use that term with all respect, by the way. Good. Okay, good. So I'll get rid of that. I'm sorry, Jim. I'm going to stop the subsidy to PBS. I'm going to stop other things. I like PBS. I love Big Bird. I actually like you, too. But I'm not going to keep on spending money on things to borrow money from China to pay for. So that's number one.
Well, just after that, everybody with an ounce of common sense realized, wait a second. Not only is federal spending on PBS a drop in the bucket, it's not even a drop in the bucket of all federal spending. Some people actually realized, hey, PBS and NPR are actually pretty valuable. In fact, they're so valuable that they create the most informed news consumers out of all media outlets in the United States. If you go back 10 years, maybe even 15 years, study after study that measures how much do people know relative to what their primary source of news is, PBS and NPR create some of the most informed news consumers in the United States, which kind of tells us everything we need to know about why Trump wants to cut funding to them, right? Because the enemy of Trump is informed people, period. And Trump's new budget would end funding, period, to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is where the money comes from for PBS and NPR. Now, let's go through the talking points of the defenders of this tax cut. Some defenders will say, David, come on, listen. Trump's cutting 100% of federal funding for PBS and NPR, but federal funding is only a small portion of all funding for PBS and NPR, and they're going to be fine. The problem is that funding for public media has been on the decline already for a long time, and because of demographic issues, PBS and NPR generally have older donors. They've been hurt because some of those viewers and listeners have, sort of put it bluntly, they've been dying off. And the other point is that just because federal funding is a small portion of the total NPR and PBS funding, there are individual stations in less privileged areas and less populated areas that are much more dependent on the federal funding. Here in Boston, we have the monster that is WGBH, where so much national PBS programming originates. WGBH is probably going to be fine without the federal funding. But the PBS stations in the Midwest and in the South and the NPR stations in the mountain states, those stations are much more dependent on that federal funding. And this money overall actually has a lot of importance. This is a political attack. And this is why I said the budget is a political document. Trump benefits from people not tuning into PBS and not listening to NPR, not because they are partisan, but because they do investigative reporting, period. What can be done? I actually don't know. I mean, the budget, as I said, needs to be approved by Congress. Call your elected officials and tell them don't cut funding for PBS and NPR?
Yeah, I mean, it may come down to people just donating directly to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Sure.
The cost of their budget that they get from the government is about $500 million,
Yeah.
which really isn't that much. That equals out to about $1.37 per person.
Yeah.
I'm willing to pay that. I know that you're willing to pay that,
Sure.
especially because this is very valuable. It's unbiased reporting from a reputable source that's been around for a long time. And I think it should continue.
When we're talking about millions rather than billions in the federal budget, we're probably already paying attention to the wrong thing, right? We are talking about a drop in the bucket and a concerted effort to dumb down the electorate to win votes, period. And we've got to stop it. So call your elected officials, tell them you support funding. You want an increase in funding for PBS and NPR.
It's probably a bad time for the David Pakman Show to apply for public funding.
Yeah, I know that. We've never had public funding.
Okay.
And I think that that's one of the, when I go to stations that have lost programs that depended on public funding, I actually tell them, we don't depend on public funding, so you don't have to worry about our program going away when Trump or whoever decides to cut funding to the David Pakman Show. That's a good thing, actually. It is a good thing, although we still should fund PBS and NPR. Send me your thoughts about this atrocity of a budget. I'm on Twitter at @dpakman. We'll be back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Katya Mallet. Katya, thank you so much for being a David Pakman Show member, and thank you not only to our new members, but also our sustaining and longtime members. Today's sustaining member of the day is Kevin Hoffman. Kevin Hoffman, who has been a member since January 20th of 2011. Can you imagine, on the 6-year anniversary of Kevin's membership, President Donald Trump was inaugurated President of the United States. Who would have known that back in 2011 when Kevin signed up?
That's one way to look at it, I guess.
Yeah, it's
Plenty
a silly
of other
way.
people were inaugurated too on that day.
It's a completely silly way of looking at it, but it's something. Anyway, thanks to Katya and Kevin. You can join them as members at davidpakman.com/membership. We also have Patreon as a funding platform for the show at patreon.com/davidpakmanshow. Let's talk about Devin Nunes. If we've learned nothing else about Republican Congressman Devin Nunes since he's been sort of shoved into the limelight by his dim-witted and reckless wanderings into interfering with the Trump-Russia investigation. It is that Devin Nunes is the epitome of the hyper-partisan loser that we should all want out of Congress sooner than later. Remember, when he was running the House investigation, he went to Donald Trump and said, hey, here's what we're doing in the House investigation. Remember when he made a huge to-do about his memo based on intelligence he hadn't even seen, which he said was going to totally shock us in terms of the partisan nature of Robert Mueller's investigation. Remember when he went on Fox News' Fox and Friends last week, and he said the provable lie that Trump and indicted advisor George Papadopoulos had never met. Anyway, much like the presidency has been a huge nightmare for the Trump family in many ways, I don't think the recent publicity for Devin Nunes has been particularly good for him, and it's getting even worse now. There's a so-called news website called the California Republican, and the California Republican was churning out just all sorts of pond scum drivel, promoting nonsense about the entire release the memo non-scandal and endless other stories. And the website had been registered to a political consultant named Alex Tavlian, but Politico did an investigation, and lo and behold, it appears as though the news website is actually run by the campaign of one Devin Nunes, Republican from California. And after Politico reported on this, the website for the California Republican has mysteriously gone offline. But they put up a Facebook message saying that it was a result of heavy traffic and an attack on their servers that has led to the California Republican being down. Republican Devin Nunes has been caught running a fake news website. Now, I'm not saying, quote, fake news, end quote. I'm saying a news website that is fake in the sense that it's run by a Republican member of Congress and a particularly partisan one. And hey, listen, if Nunes doesn't like the reporting that's out there, he conveniently can just create his own news website and report whatever the hell he wants. Here's a tweet from the California Republican Twitter account pronouncing that Devin Nunes is a hero with the quote, "This is what a hero looks like." And it's a picture of Devin Nunes looking either pained or constipated, unclear which. Is anything real about Devin Nunes? I mean, bogus memos based on intel he hasn't seen, news websites that are actually campaign-linked propaganda. This guy is one of the worst, isn't he?
You know what this reminds me of? Remember there were a few weeks back in the summer where the Trump administration was putting out a show of its own that they called Real News?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And they had Eric Trump's wife starring in one of the episodes. And
Is that
Haley
Lara
McEnany.
Trump?
Lara Trump, yep.
Yeah.
But at least then you knew that it was from the administration.
That's right,
I mean,
yeah.
They tried to hide this.
I'd love to know who came up with this, right? Like, imagine Devin Nunes going to some PR consultants saying, listen, I'm getting crushed by negative stories and we got to take control back. Here's an idea. Create your own news website and then just publish whatever you want, including tweets that you're a hero. Nunes is kind of like the kid in high school who tried to cheat on everything, but he was sort of too incompetent to do it. So it backfired, and it ended up even worse than if he just got a mediocre grade on the test. That's the equivalent of what Devin Nunes is doing here. And the guy's got to go. And hey, you know what? You can vote him out in 8 months because every single one of these guys and gals are up for re-election in November.
And he's from California, too. Now, I don't know how conservative the district that he's from is.
Medium.
But
yeah.
I'm sure he has a chance
He has
of
a
losing.
chance. Yeah, he has a chance of losing and he has a chance of winning.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you could get him out, but it's not going to be the easiest. Last week, I told you that a Supreme Court decision has mandated that, yes, Pennsylvania has to redraw its congressional districts. Pennsylvania's congressional districts have been so gerrymandered since the 2010 census and the 2011 redistricting that took place that even though you have 800,000 more Democrats than Republicans in Pennsylvania, Republicans have controlled about 2/3 of the 18 congressional districts for a long time. Well, they did it. Pennsylvania Republicans drew brand new congressional districts, and they are basically just as gerrymandered as before. We have a map of the new districts overlaid above the county level results from the 2016 election. And what you'll notice if you're looking at the map is that the bluer areas are strategically drawn into districts to achieve the exact same thing as before, which is that even though Republicans are at a deficit in terms of voters in Pennsylvania, they hold advantage in a majority of districts. And there was an interesting analysis done by it was either the Washington Post or the New York Times, where what they did is they sort of looked at how the districts were drawn in 2016 when Trump won 12 of 18 districts. And then they retabulated the 2016 presidential election results based on the new drawing of the districts. Trump would have also won 12 districts with the new drawing, which tells us that this is still just as gerrymandered. Now, in the interest of sort of being fair, right, we know that because Democratic voters tend to be more in urban areas and Republican voters tend to be more in rural areas, that does create some base level of advantage for Republicans at the congressional district level, but not winning 2/3 of all districts 3 elections in a row, despite being at a significant disadvantage in terms of the number of registered Republicans. So this is obviously completely ridiculous. They are claiming, the Republicans are claiming, no, we redrew the districts without partisan data in hand. That's the stupidest excuse I've ever heard. If you're familiar with the state's politics and the geographical distribution of voters, you don't need a partisan list in order to draw a partisan map. And now we'll have to see ultimately what the Democratic governor of Pennsylvania decides. And this is why I've been saying we've got to vote, because now that these new districts are going to be challenged legally, the Democratic governor of Pennsylvania gets to look at it and say yes or no. And if he says no, then a nonpartisan redistrictor, an expert in drawing districts, is going to take over. This is why it matters whether the governor is a Republican or a Democrat. This is why it matters if the state Senate or the state legislature has a majority of Republicans or Democrats. And this is why I've been talking about the importance of the census for years. Even though these are not, as I've said before, the most exciting topics to discuss, this stuff has such an impact.
And we do need an independent commission, because whenever Republicans are in control of the state legislature, they draw the lines in favor of their party. And Democrats, whenever they're in charge of the state legislature, they draw the lines in control of their party too. And so if we had just representatives from both parties or unbiased arbiters who are able to draw these maps, it would turn out a lot better. Or maybe even put it in the control of the courts. They're used to being unbiased.
There's a bunch of different ways you can do it. There a bipartisan commission, some kind of uninvolved, nonpartisan agency, courts. Basically, any option is better than what's being done.
No system's going to be perfect.
No system will be perfect, but we know that one of the worst systems is letting whoever happened to win the last election after the last census, putting them in charge of just drawing the districts how they want. That's what leads to the disasters that we've seen. I mean, it's happened in Massachusetts. It's happened in Illinois. There's a lot of places with just wacky and crazy districts.
And it took the U.S. Supreme Court 7 years to throw out the first Pennsylvania map.
That's right.
They can't wait another 7. We only have another 3 years left before the next census.
That's right. The time that it takes to fix these problems is absolutely unconscionable. A West Virginia police officer was fired for not shooting a suspect that was distraught. The officer has sued for wrongful termination and has been awarded $175,000. I'm talking about Officer Stephen Mader, who back in 2016 was called to a domestic disturbance, very, very common call for police. Officer Mader showed up, and there was a 23-year-old named Ronald Williams Jr., who was holding an unloaded handgun and was clearly out of sorts. And Williams told Officer Mader to shoot him. And Officer Mader made a judgment call that this was a mentally disturbed individual who was not a threat, who was maybe trying to commit suicide by cop. And Stephen Mader made the decision not to shoot him. He instead tried to de-escalate, to calm the situation down. And he started to do that until 2 other police officers showed up. And at that point, Williams raised his gun and was shot dead by one of the other officers. And it was ruled a justifiable shooting by the police. The local police department, Weirton, West Virginia's police department, decided that they were going to fire Officer Stephen Mader, saying he did the wrong thing. He should have shot Mr. Williams straight away. And when people started questioning the firing, saying, wait a second, he identified correctly that the gun was not loaded, that this man was not a threat, and tried to de-escalate, and then you fire the guy, the police department said, well, it wasn't just the non-shooting. There was this other incident involving putting a ticket in someone's car without a warrant, and another incident where he didn't report an elderly woman's death as suspicious, and it's because of all the stuff together that we decided to fire him. There's questions about those other two incidents, right? But let's focus on the shooting incident. Every indication is that the suspect wanted to be shot dead by police. The officer who showed up astutely recognized this and tried to de-escalate. This is what we should be encouraging, not what we should be discouraging. And instead, we fired, the police department in Weirton, West Virginia, fired Stephen Mader. Ultimately, he sued and he won $175,000. But the real problem is the message that it sends, which is don't shoot and you might end up in trouble. And that's not a good message to be sending.
Yeah, don't use your judgment, right? And if Mader had shot and killed this victim, I don't think I would blame him, because maybe it was going to be suicide by cop that he was trying to do. But you never really know. You never know if the gun's loaded. You never know if it's a fake gun or a real gun. You have to make that split-second decision.
That's right.
And it turns out that Mader actually made the right choice in not shooting him.
Now the defenders of the police are saying it's not because of the non-shooting, it's for other reasons. But that is a sort of ex post facto thing that the police department came up with once the firing went bad. And we hear about we need more pro-police sentiment. Isn't firing an officer for making a good decision about a mentally disturbed subject with an unloaded gun, isn't that anti-police action by the police department? Shouldn't we be supporting the officers that are making the right calls in the field? Yet another one of these horrible stories that actually makes me understand why you are going to see police err on the side of shooting rather than not shooting in situations like this.
It's almost like when you have a law enforcement officer who does protect and serve the public, then they're ousted, then they have to go. But that's supposed to be the mission of the police.
$175,000 though, so there you go. That's something, but who knows now what his ability is to get hired elsewhere after having been fired in this way. Send me your thoughts. Discuss this on our subreddit at davidpakman.com/REDDIT. We'll be back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Molly McHugh has joined us on the program before. She is back today. She is a foreign policy and strategy consultant, also an information warfare expert. She had a really interesting article in Politico, actually, about the Release the Memo hashtag, which we've been talking about quite a bit. And Molly, what you reported is that there actually was significant bot activity behind that memo. And from the beginning, it appeared to me to be a very concerted sort of distraction technique, actually, from the substance of the FBI investigation by Robert Mueller. Talk to us about how you first started following this.
Well, obviously we started paying attention to it. Our team here at New Media Frontier, our new company, we started paying attention to this because it was being amplified so quickly, and it went from being nowhere to being everywhere at the same time. And how that happens is always a really interesting process. I think there were some initial reports, people saying it's Russian bots pushing this hashtag, or it's something else pushing this hashtag. And what that actually is and how it happens is much more interesting, a process to dig into, which is why we started looking at it. And I think we lay out in the Politico piece pretty clearly that it's actually a blend of a variety of different elements that came together to make this campaign work effectively. There were Russian bots, there were other bots, there were sort of far-right information networks in the US engaged in these campaigns. Some of the accounts are automated, some of the accounts are people, some of the accounts are semi-automated. So it's sort of a layering on of techniques and tactics to take a topic, sort of organize a bunch of things behind the same campaign, and then target it at lawmakers and others who are going to be making decisions on this topic. And so it's sort of those three factors, the amplification, the targeting, and the organization, that were really effective in how this worked, how these elements came together and worked very effectively in achieving the outcome they desired.
Can you talk a little bit about the targeting piece?
Sure. So a lot of the initial tweets that started from sort of a very low-level network on Twitter were tagging Republican congressmen either from the House Intelligence Committee or some of the more sort of pro-Trump White House defender voices on the Hill. So people like Matt Gaetz, Lee Zeldin, some were tagging Paul Ryan as well. So people who are involved in lobbying their Republican colleagues and themselves having to vote within the Intelligence Committee on releasing the memo were being heavily targeted by these messages on social media. So sort of hundreds of thousands of times over the week and a half. This was an active campaign before the committee voted. And that is essentially an effective form of influence and lobbying in terms of getting a message in front of an elected official and then getting them to act on that information.
When we first mentioned that there was a lot of bot activity around this hashtag, I would get sort of anecdotal emails from people saying, David, I used the hashtag and I was not part of either a Russian coordinated effort nor people lobbying members of Congress or whatever else. Can you talk a little bit about how maybe the term useful idiot applies here? And again, that's not an ad hominem. That's actually a term that has a very, very specific meaning, where these campaigns don't actually require the sort of conspiratorial knowledge of all participants to be effective.
No, that's exactly right. And I think that that's where these echo chambers are really effective. There is behind and underneath a lot of what we see online, there is a lot more organization and purposefulness than I think we often admit. There are on the far right and the far left, but more so on the far right, it's been documented and discussed a lot, these sort of rooms and chat groups and sort of other organizational tools that are being used by far right and alt-right interests in the United States to coordinate their messaging campaigns and build them online. That does exist, but that's not to say everything is behind a puppet master. You know, once people have established networks on Twitter, they promote things from people they know and trust, same on Facebook, same on other social media. So once you build these structures, it's far easier to introduce information to them and get them to move in the places that you want them to. And I think sometimes people just aren't aware of how they are engaged in this. However, there are a lot of people that are aware of what they're doing. And the combination of those things, of real people's accounts who are basically semi-automated, acting like human bots themselves. So their accounts automatically follow and retweet and promote content from specific accounts, from specific narratives. So you have accounts of real people who were tweeting "release the memo" 100 times in a day. That is not normal behavior for any one social media account. So they're sort of knowingly and purposefully acting and saying, we need to promote this to make this trend. And that is an interesting element of the different pieces that we were looking at, because there's sort of the human automation / amplification side and the straight sort of bot, actual automated, scripted by algorithms side. And the combination of those two is very effective. And the goal of both of them is essentially to build these trends, to target people that will see them, and to get that information into and promoted from verified accounts. Because once you hit get a verified account to promote these on Twitter, the amplification occurs much more quickly.
Can you talk a little bit about the sort of function of analytical software to look through the usage and the sort of pattern of usage of the hashtag? Because people might hear you and I talking now and they'll say, okay, it must, Molly McHugh scrolling through a Twitter feed manually is not going to give us anything beyond sort of anecdotal information, but we're talking about the use of actual analytical software to examine this hashtag, are we not?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a combination of software that we're building ourselves, plus some of the commercially available tools. And some of it is sort of free online things to do this, but we looked at this in a variety of ways. Some of it was scrolling through specific accounts in painful detail, trying to figure out who they were, what they were. where they came from, etc. But you also have to look at the volume over time, the number of accounts engaged in these campaigns, how they acted together, sort of where the information comes from, where it gets injected to, how it gets promoted ultimately over time. And that is, there's a variety of ways to do that, software that visualizes things in different ways that can pull data from different places. But in particular for this campaign, it was useful for us to have access to some of the stored Twitter data, because a lot of the accounts that were engaged in this campaign have either been deleted or suspended or have deleted their own content on the Release the Memo hashtag since the memo was released, which is also interesting. So you kind of need these different elements coming together to look at this. And I think that one of the best examples of this was there was, I think a blogger or something, but who had published his own analysis of the origins of Release the Memo, but he got it wrong because he didn't have access to the information from the account that have been released or blocked. And that was important to have to be able to look at the beginning of the campaign.
In sort of layman's terms, I think that this succeeded in the sense that it did significantly pull attention away from the sort of subject matter of Robert Mueller's investigation, but also from other stories that were not particularly positive stories for Donald Trump. And for several days, it really got a lot of attention. But that's just sort of me taking like a generalist perspective. How would you assess the success of this campaign?
In a variety of different ways, it was extremely successful. And I think in the most basic level, the goal of establishing these types of information networks through social media or through other means is building and using activation potential. And in this case, it worked very effectively. You had an extremely engaged community pushing this narrative, pushing this idea. It doesn't ultimately matter what the memo was or what was in it. I don't think it changed anybody's mind about it one way or the other. But it was the organizing power of the idea of Release the Memo has now created a very comprehensive and detailed conspiracy architecture into which a lot of the narratives currently being pushed from the same lanes make a lot of sense. You know, the FBI is bad, U.S. intelligence is bad, the U.S. is surveilling its own people, this is bad. All of this kind of fits into the talking points that you hear coming, unfortunately, from the Oval Office and from other right media in the U.S. But this one hashtag became kind of the organizing principle in people's heads for how this made sense. So it was extremely effective in a variety of ways.
How else might we measure it? In other words, are there any numerical comparisons that can be made, or what else do you look at when you're sort of looking at the spread of the hashtag?
Well, there were a couple of things that we were using to look at how widespread or effective this was. One was on the targeting piece for Congress, and I think the volume there spoke, it said a lot. There were hundreds of thousands of tweets targeting members on the committee before they voted to release the memo. And if you compare that to sort of a very active period when there would have been constituents, like actual people calling into congressional offices about healthcare, about, you know, the tax bill, about some vote that's happening that people want to have their voices heard on, this was, you know, 3 times that amount of volume per day in some cases in terms of how many messages an individual member would have been getting. So the perception for them would have been this is something that has a tremendous amount of support behind it, even if they don't know what the origins of that are. Their Twitter mentions and timelines would have been totally flooded by this concept, and that does make an impression on how people think about these things. The other thing, we tried to compare the Release the Memo campaign to 2 other sort of similarly timed events that were actually happening, the 2018 Women's March and an NFL playoff game that was that weekend. And if you look at the total volume of tweets that were coming from over a similar period of time, so about 8 hours of time, if you look at the total volume of tweets coming from what we know were around a million women and other participants engaging in these demonstrations, and then a lot of people watching a very popular national football event, in both cases, those were, you know, a third or less of the volume of tweets as the Release the Memo hashtag was getting when it was being promoted. And I think that's really significant, that initial ramp up phase was so quick, that it was happening late at night, that it was happening primarily without the engagement of some of the big amplifiers that we all know, Hannity, Ingraham, people like that. They were engaged very late in the campaign. This was coming from other places before the big voices got involved.
Check out Molly McHugh's article in Politico, How Twitter Bots and Trump Fans Made Release the Memo Go Viral. Molly, thanks as always for talking to us.
Thanks for having me on.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Hey, I have good news for you from the world of science and reason. Georgian College, which is a college in Ontario, Canada, has canceled their diploma in the bogus pseudoscience of homeopathy after the program started to receive more and more criticism because, of course, homeopathy has no place in colleges and universities. The Georgian College put out a statement where they said, quote, "In light of the recent response from our local community and beyond, and in consideration of our students, Georgian College has made the decision to cancel the homeopathy program." There's been a huge uproar, actually, from the medical community about this program. And from the CBC's coverage of this, they wrote, quote, "Dr. Chris Gershev, an emergency medicine physician, sent letters of protest to the college and to the provincial government after seeing an advertisement for the program, which would have been offered at the nearby campus in Barrie, Ontario. He worried there would be a risk to public health if people assumed homeopathy has some legitimacy. It gave me some angst about the whole thing," he said. Gershev is already seeing evidence of homeopathy's impact in his hospital's emergency room. We see people, they have the flu and they're sick. And I ask, did you get a flu shot? And they say, my homeopath gave me a flu shot. And I think, well, you didn't actually get anything. Now, I know that there are many people in our audience who don't know that homeopathy is a scam. Lots of people consider it sort of the same as herbal remedies, for example, which can mean many different things when you even say herbal remedies. Homeopathy is a non-science, right? Some people call it pseudoscience. I call it non-science. It comes from the 18th century. And the concept is you take substances and you dilute them extensively. Huge dilution, like taking a spoonful of something and putting it in Lake Michigan and stirring it up and saying, here, drink a cup of this. That's often an analogy that's used. Homeopathy is not herbal medicine because herbal medicines, whether or not they work, contain ingredients. And the concept of homeopathy is such dilution of whatever so-called ingredient is there that there is effectively no active ingredient in much of homeopathy. And you can usually only measure the inactive ingredients, like the sugar in the little pills that they give you. Homeopathy has no effect. It cannot treat or cure any symptoms or diseases. And in more and more countries, it actually has to be labeled that way. And it does bum me out because I believe, I meet people who believe in this stuff. They believe in homeopathy. They believe in Reiki. Reiki is a special one. People get tricked into thinking Reiki is some ancient healing art. It was invented in 1922, right? And I find it fascinating that, like for Reiki, for example, the concept is one that appeals to the non-religious, but it's kind of based on the same principles as religion. Reiki is based on the idea that you're moving energy around through your hands to heal people and improve symptoms, provide pain relief, whatever. And you don't even need to know what symptoms the person has. Just putting your hands over the person will have the energy find the ailment. That's similar to the idea of a soul, right? Which is a religious idea, the idea of some invisible life force that goes beyond knowledge and physiology. And anyway, homeopathy, Reiki, it's mostly harmless, except, I guess, to your wallet when you start spending money on this stuff, except when people go to this stuff instead of real treatments for medical issues that can actually harm them. And I understand being skeptical of the profit motive of Western medicine. I get that. But just because you're skeptical of the profit motive doesn't mean you go to Reiki and homeopathy, you know?
Yeah, and it's also a problem because Georgian College is a public university.
Absolutely.
Too, so the taxpayers in Canada are paying for this. And it's
insane.
one thing if you want to go to a private organization to learn about homeopathy or take up religious studies, as long as there's no fraud involved. But the fact that taxpayers are footing the bill, that's a problem.
Absolutely inappropriate. This is completely the right decision. And I know there are people online who are mad with Georgian College saying, no, this is a public service. It's great that they were actually doing this, blah, blah, blah. It has no place there. It has absolutely no place there. I've been noticing a more acute anti-flu vaccine movement recently, and I think it's because this year the flu vaccine has a lower effectiveness than it has had in years past. And we recently learned that a Texas teacher named Heather Holland died from flu-related complications. And the story is particularly tragic, not only because she died, but because of what it says about money and our healthcare system. Holland got sick a little over a week ago, and she was prescribed flu medication, but she was delaying picking up the flu medication because it had a $116 co-payment based on her health insurance, and that was a lot of money for Heather Holland. Her husband didn't realize that's why she hadn't picked up the medication. Once he found out, he went and bought the prescription for the $116, but that was later in the course of illness, and her health never recovered, and she ultimately died. Now, do we know for sure that she would have survived if she had paid the $160 code payment at the beginning, or if it hadn't been a barrier? No, we don't know that 100%, but it's definitely possible, and it's horrible. And her husband is now left with their 10-year-old daughter and their 7-year-old son. We just can't afford health care for everybody, we are told, but we have money for wars and weapons and walls with Mexico. All of that stuff we have, but yet Heather Holland died and didn't have the $116 copay for her flu medication. And this is a great example of why healthcare doesn't work in the free market, right? The free market conservative would tell us, oh, no. If there's a market opportunity, like if there's a demand for a lower priced flu medication, some company is going to seize that and they'll provide something for $80 or $60 or whatever. Well, in this case, they didn't. So is the free market solution that it's right that Heather Holland died, that it's correct that Heather Holland died? How do you justify that? And the reason it's not happening the way the free market right tells us it should is that pharmaceutical companies just aren't competing to lower prices. In fact, the opposite is true. You have these sort of oligopolies in many medication markets, and you also have a patent system which creates even more monopolistic circumstances. So this is a disgusting story. It's a tragic story. And it's also connected to the anti-vaxxers. Heather Holland, this is not an anti-vaxxer thing about Heather Holland, but you have a lot of anti-vaxxers saying, hey, did you see the flu shot is only 10% effective this year? Yeah. So you shouldn't get it, and it's terrible, and blah, blah, blah. The flu shot this year might only be 10% effective in terms of full flu immunity, but it's still effective at reducing some combination of the length and severity of the flu, at least to some degree. But the anti-vaxxers are out hard this year, more than in recent years. And we might be doing a follow-up to our long-form piece on vaccines, doing one more specifically on the anti-vaxxer movement, because they're having they're having an impact, and it's absolutely and totally horrible. We have a voicemail. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here is a voicemail about the alt-right and about so-called SJWs. Take a listen to this.
Hey, David. Kurt from Alabama here. I was just wondering about your opinion on why do you think the right, the alt-right, libertarians in general, are so obsessed with the social justice warriors and whatnot? Yep. If you could just let me know, that'd be awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. This lends itself to a sort of longer answer, but the short answer as to why the alt-right is obsessed with criticizing social justice warriors is that they're an easy target, right? So the so-called social justice warriors that the alt-right likes to criticize make up a tiny, tiny fraction of the left, and they are low-hanging fruit. Yeah. And by criticizing them, you're caricaturing a minority element of the left without actually having to deal with the very, very significant shortcomings of alt-right ideology to the extent that it is an ideology. And you can avoid having to actually talk about real issues and solve some of the difficult problems that we have going on. Just criticize SJWs or some trigger warning or something like that. And, you know, I criticize that stuff too, but I criticize it in proportion to how much of a problem it is. and don't blow it up. But it's just an easy target for the alt-right. That's what it is.
Yeah, it's very easy to debate someone who doesn't believe in free speech, or you can tell there are clear contradictions with how they talk about racism and these other issues. But it is just a small segment of the left, and I think they would rather debate against those people than talk about taxes,
of course,
and healthcare and all that other stuff.
No question about it, and that's why they're doing it. And it's become very profitable, actually, online. You can make a lot of money just criticizing social justice warriors and pretending that they're sort of a microcosm of the left, when in fact they're kind of the exception to the left in most cases.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see if that contingency starts to grow more or fades away over time.
Yeah, the contingent. Yeah, that's a good question. I think that they are eventually going to fade away. That's my view. We've got a great bonus show for you today. DavidPakman.com/membership, Patreon.com/DavidPakman. So don't miss the bonus show. It's a good one.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.